Thanks for coming back to the news edition of the Startup Scaffold podcast. What we do every week is we break down one or two of the biggest news stories and contextualize it to the construction tech industry. So that could be entrepreneurs in the industry, executives, or just industry participants. And we have Kaustubh here as our guest expert today, who's a partner at Brick Mortar Ventures.
Yep.
And well-known, infamous actually, for writing all the McKinsey reports that everyone here pretty much references. And for every in-person interview, we have one of our special things, which is I've got a tub of Vegemite actually. I brought over from Australia. So Kaustubh is going to have his first piece, or maybe second, at least in a long time, piece of Vegemite. So have a taste.
That's why I have water and everything else next to it. Oh, no, in small quantity, it's not bad.
Oh, it's not bad.
No, I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon. It just, yeah, that is a one bite thing, for sure. Oh man, oh yeah.
I can smell it from here.
All right, yes, expert. We'll speak. We'll find out.
I can still smell the Vegemite. Yeah.
Oh yeah, is that lingering taste.
Warning to future in-person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, so we'll kick it off. So the way I wanted to frame today's conversation was the big news was the White House put out a public comment for an AI action plan, and we got the response from OpenAI. And I really expect, and a lot of commentators do expect, that a lot of the recommendations from OpenAI will be accommodated by this current administration. And some of the key takeaways in terms of construction was they were asking for a National Transmission Act. So it takes over 10 years to plan and to build a new transmission in the country. And then AI economic zones. So they were saying we want areas where data centers are prioritized and also energy. So solar, wind, nuclear. They want NEPA exclusions on national security grounds. So the entire framing was we want to beat China. We want democratic AI to win. And to do this, we need to build as quickly as possible. And what it reminds me is something that Brian Potter of Construction Physics said, which was it's become harder and harder to build quickly and cheaply in the US because regulation continues to rise. But at the same time, we haven't had increases in productivity or technology. So I wanted to hear both of your perspectives as investors. Do you agree with that sentiment? And then if you do agree with that sentiment and why, what do you think from a technology background or basis, can we actually fix this? Or do we need to start fixing and addressing the regulation that's making it harder to build?
I can get started. So I think couple of things you're going to highlight. One, we can't say productivity has not improved globally in general. I think if you look at certain sectors, with a straight face, you can't say we have not built data centers faster than what we were building 10, 50 years ago. Or maybe not 50, but 10, 20 years ago. So I think there have been pockets of excellence when it comes to productivity. When you think about how do regulations impact it, so now you look at public projects versus private projects, I think US is definitely much, much harder. Most contractors actually price that in. I'll reference a study in a previous life of mine. We looked at a bunch of medical centers for a public entity. And this is a public report that we can link if you want. And what was interesting is to look at what is a medical center that is almost private and public at the same time. This was right after Hurricane Katrina. So it was almost a public experiment that you can do almost the same time that you're building it up. And long short of it was twice as expensive on $1 per square foot just to build something that was public versus private across the street was much cheaper.
So the government, whatever, was it regulatory? Was it the government was paying over? Like, why?
I think a lot of contractors know that it's not easiest to work with the government. It's going to take longer for change orders. It's going to get longer for paying. They just price that in. At the end of the day, and this is what we learned in the interviews as well, right? It's just like, okay, fine, you might be working exactly with the same folks, but they might get a different price because they know there's friction that they're pricing in to that lump sum job, or perhaps just even the work of making sure that I can do this product in delivery. Because a lot of the scopes, a lot of the changes I'm going to be doing will be a government process versus a private process that a private client that might have worked with in the past.
There's also like labor reporting requirements or compliance requirements. I know from like a audit perspective, I worked on a public hospital job, and it was like every year they would have to go through some audit to make sure that tax dollars were spent properly, on the construction job and all that. So I think just the amount of like audit, oversight,
Red tape.
reporting, all of that. I'm sure all of that just kind of gets factored in.
Yeah, wow. That's really interesting because I assume that someone in the government's also doing a study and comparing private to public and going, why are we paying more? And then they'll go, hey, we're paying too much. We don't want to actually build because we're overpaying consistently. So doesn't that affect the delivery of public infrastructure?
In a way, yes. In a way, no. Because I think the cost of doing business with the government, can you make it less frictionless or like in a different way, right? So this is where technology comes into play. How do I make it less regulations is one part. How do I make it most transparent? How do I make it more efficient? Whether it's, let's use labor as an example, right? What can I use from a technology standpoint that allows me to capture some of these, I would say, burdensome requirements on reporting to be more efficient? So there's versions of that where you'll find it. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. But I also don't think it's going to reduce our appetite for building from a public standpoint. Yeah. I think the nation's needs are there. That demand is there. And I think we are able to catalyze quite a bit of capital on making that. So going back to the National Transmission Act, right? That's a good example. We realize this is a national priority. We are very good at when there's a national priority to make things happen. And I think the country can get behind that pretty fast. So that's been a good lesson, at least on those kind of things.
Yeah, but they're making it happen by reducing red tape. So then there's the argument of, generally speaking, do we just have too much red tape? Like, how do we redo that? Or like, is that from a lobbying standpoint? Because that also brings, as a startup, I need to start thinking about, policy risk. If I'm building nuclear SMRs, I need to think about policy risks. As an investor, I need to time the market where the policy's starting to shape. So I get a good valuation. If I wait too long, I'm not going to get that. So how do you do that?
It's a really good question. The way I think about that one is the challenge you often run into is each jurisdiction has its own rules and regulations, and we as a country have empowered them for certain parts of it. And that's just DNA of the country. So going against in some cases is kind of hard to do, but you can enable in some cases, right? So live examples, especially when it comes to technology, right? We looked at a lot of permitting startups in the last year, 2 years, maybe 4. I forget how long.
Yeah.
But a few things we run into some of these cases is you don't necessarily need to improve just the process. There needs to be jurisdiction allowance that says, hey, I think you can throw as much technology as you want at this problem, but unless you create an incentive, either for public employees on the other side or enable an authorized agent that can take over that burdensome job that allows you to scale, that's when you figure it out. And can I do that overnight? No. Can I even actually make a state or a jurisdiction do this overnight? Probably not. But I can start making those changes slowly. It says, hey, this is the direction we're going in. So some of the states have done that. So now when I put my venture back hat on, as an investor, I can't count on statewide legislation to take place in a venture time frame, right? So that's a risk we have to underwrite or a risk we have to evaluate. But I think it's a good thing that it's the right time we've seen that at least the steps to be taken in that space.
Yeah, and I think for us, like, given that we kind of grew up in the US and like things can swing drastically in like 2 or 4 year time frames, I know at least for our team, we've always looked at anything that's regulatory related. We're not betting on that, right? Because who knows, something might happen in 2 years, 4 years, whatever that time frame is. So you really have to dig into, is this something that the industry will adopt or leverage or use, regardless of regulatory, right? The regulatory change may help catalyze some of that and may kind of make people more aware, more interested, whatever it is. But like, can this stand on its own without regulatory? And I think that's a really big difference for us kind of living here in the US versus in many other countries or other parts of the world where you can almost kind of depend on things not changing from a regulatory perspective.
We are fickle in some of those.
Yeah. But it is an interesting challenge that seems exclusive to the US, because if I look over at the European market and I think about, what is it, the Building Performance Directive, which is EU top-down policy, but here everything is bottom-up, right? You have jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and then you have lawsuits on everything. So does it just really make it challenging as a startup? You need to be really clear in understanding, doing your discovery and going, how do I minimize regulatory risk as much as possible? Like, is that just another lens that a US startup needs compared to other ones?
But
Go
that's
ahead.
also an opportunity, right? It's like, look at the mess of these different layers of stuff. And how do I make it easy for other, maybe even like other startups to leverage, my data to then, go fix some of these challenges, right? So
Yeah.
a good example is there's a company that's actually aggregated a bunch of permitting information, right? And they're actually selling that information to some of these other startups who are then building companies on top of that, right? And a lot of that has to do with all of this information is in like 10 different places, depending on where you are in the US. And, because you may have city level, state level, federal level, whatever it is, right? All of that is everywhere. So I think there's opportunities for a lot of these businesses, whether or not they're venture backed, businesses to basically clean and organize a lot of this data. So I don't know, I kind of see it both ways. Like, yes, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And if you could figure out the opportunity, then I think that could be very helpful for everyone, and that's a business in its own.
It lowers the cost of building the real solution, right? So permitting is a good example. I have yet to see somebody or talk to somebody that says my permitting experience was delightful.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Anyone has ever said that. No matter what side of the table you're on, whether you're the contractor, AE, owner, or even the folks who are actually permitting, it's just a painful process and frustrating process. But solving that problem might require you innovating on multiple aspects.
Yeah.
Does every company need to innovate in some of these cases? Or this is selling blue jeans or shovels in a gold rush? Can I actually do that and make sure not everyone's solving the same problem, but I will enable you to solve other problems? So that's kind of the opportunity that she's talking about, which we definitely love, because I think that means you are able to move the industry forward. In many ways.
But I guess that frustrates me personally because I see it as piecemeal change. And I go, well, how do you actually make large-scale change on the core problem of how do we build faster and cheaper? Like affordable housing, all these other challenges continue to rise. And even from an infrastructure perspective, infrastructure needs to be maintained, rebuilt from the government, and taxation would probably have to increase to facilitate that. So how do you actually fix that, right? Like we often talk about, hey, techno-optimism, let's use technology to fix everything. But I think in construction, technology can't fix everything. We have governance issues, we have policy issues.
Yeah.
How do we actually fix this?
I mean, one opportunity is productization, right? I think there's been a lot of companies that are trying to, take a building, break it into smaller components, and then productize that, right? You can get approval once, whether it's UL listing or whatever it is. Get approval once, get it approved, and hopefully you can kind of reuse that component many times. Obviously, this is like the challenge with construction is like everything that you build is bespoke, right? Yeah. It's a long supply chain, everything is unique, everything's basically custom. So, I mean, I'm of the camp of we should standardize as much as we can, because I do think that will help us build faster and cheaper. But then again, it's like we also know that everyone has different preferences and how they want to see things, how they want to live, even like office space, right? Not everyone wants to go into like Severance World, like white walls and whatever. But I do think productizing is an opportunity, and we have seen some of this on like the ADU or the like housing side, where if you can basically build the same thing over and over again and you get it pre-approved, right? In California, there are ADU drawings, details, plans that have been pre-approved, and that's kind of sped up that process. So to whatever extent that we could productize more of our construction supply chain, I do think that's an opportunity.
I think the other vector you can get into is which sectors or what type of customers might allow you to do this faster.
Yeah.
Right. And so one way to think about that is, okay, if I am a light commercial play, which I'm doing the same, call it Starbucks every time, or that's where you're gonna see, hey, is the choice of the customer that I want to standardize because it's more efficient and it's part of their brand strategy that I want to have the same experience. And those are often verticals where you might see some of these early permitting or early kind of regulations be eased just because of the lack of friction that you might be able to get from the customer pull that you're able to get. So that's probably one other vector to kind of think about. How do I learn on that vertical and then go into a different one? It won't be done overnight.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I think that's a really interesting statement because I think about Goldbeck, which has done that for, warehousing and car parks with, hey, there's 500 components or 500 questions you ask. But it's also really interesting from an AI perspective because the AI agent startups that I see or have come across are really focused on repeatable construction. So you're building a Macca's in different places, so let's update the construction drawings for that. So maybe it does become a question of productization, using technology to streamline that entire process and then putting engineers on higher value tasks, which are more time consuming.
Yep. Yeah. What may be interesting to see is how do you bake this into, at some point, how do you bake this into regulations that are now accepted?
Mm.
And would it be bottom up or top down is going to be more interesting, right? Would you see a certain jurisdiction adopt bottom up and like, hey, we're able to build more or attract more talent or more construction that affordable housing was solved because we did this, right? Versus there's a top down version that says thou shalt have in agent, a authorized agent solution for permitting.
Mm.
Like that would be very interesting to kind of see, and then maybe there's a combination of both that will happen over time, but we'll find out.
I don't know. I'm pretty pessimistic. I'm like, here in the U.S., it's all about money and capitalism. So it's like, who's gonna figure out who's gonna be which one can we do? Cheaper, faster, better. So I don't know. I'm not very confident in the government.
Bottom up. Government coming to say it's only made things worse. But it is fascinating to see, and I think one of the interesting customers you often run into in kind of our industry is contractors who have done public jobs and the contractors who have done private jobs.
Yeah.
And then how do you think about those different jobs? And especially those are the ones who can say like, yeah, this is how I price that differently. How much public exposure do you want in some of these cases?
Yeah.
So those are the ones that I think you learn a lot from, kind of how you think about those even complex or non-complex jobs. But that's been an exciting area of learning for us, especially when it comes to solutions in our space. We often came from a public job and now going to private, or coming from a private job and getting pulled into public. Because that requires a different velocity, different customer type, and plenty other complexities there.
Yeah, and then I guess double clicking back on that policy point, is it from risk? Is that why it's so hard to change policy, to improve policy? And is there a way to negotiate or reduce that risk in effective ways, like with or without technology?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like the whole point is like checks and balances, right? A lot of the reasons why we have these regulations, and even like think about code, right? Why do we have certain things? In California, we have earthquakes. Why do we have certain code compliance from a structural perspective, right? That's all because of safety. And depending on where you are in the US, like a lot of code is also up for interpretation, and someone's stamp is on the line. There's all these things that I think impact why construction is so hard, because all of it is checks and balances, right? And if you think about even just the way that we do project management, like why should we have submittals? Submittals are for checks and balances across the construction supply chain. And it's like, if we want to be efficient, we should just get rid of them. Like they should not exist, right?
I mean, as a designer, I'm going to push back on that. I've seen some stuff, man.
What are you trying to sneak in here?
In theory, like if you're trying to make the whole process more efficient, we need to cut things out of the process that, make it easier for us to agree on things, or, even productization, right? If we build off of 100 different products, in theory, we shouldn't necessarily need a whole submittal process, right? Because it's all pre-selected, pre-picked, the performance. So I think it's like when you put it in that perspective, it's like the whole construction supply chain, there's so many different layers, and it's all about checks and balances. Like on construction, and then even like on the owner side, right? Then you go up the chain of permit review and owners have to approve it, right? And I think that all leads to this great inefficiency, and why there's so many like pieces of paper that get handed back and forth for signatures. And like even thinking about like the payment application process, right? Like everyone's trying to make it shorter and faster and whatever, right? But in theory, it actually just takes a month, because that pay app is sitting on someone's desk. And it sits there for like a week before they even see it. And literally they just need to sign something, right? And then pass it to the next person. And like that whole thing just takes like a month, because like they got 10 other things they have to work on rather than like review this pay app and sign it, right? So there's so many inefficiencies that's like, we could definitely solve it with tech, or you can solve it with a meeting, right? So it's like, do we just need better collaboration, or do we actually need tech? But
doesn't that go back to the governance structures? Like, we've all seen combative relationships. We have, you know, design and construct, and the contractor is literally lying on every change order, and we have to be on site watching them because we can't put cameras because the union won't let me put cameras, right? Like, they literally lie to us. But then at the same time, you see...
You need better contractors.
Yeah. But I mean, like, the contractor was the cheapest, you know, like, by 3 million, we saw
Not the best value, but it was technically cheapest.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, like, you think about that and it's like, well, maybe we need more integration. So maybe we shouldn't have separation as much. And we have an alliance model where we have, you know, a pool of money. So maybe it all comes back to the way risk is allocated, the way that we're all compensated and incentivized. And yes, we need tech, but maybe we need tech to enable these other alliance models or other delivery models, which hopefully will come into prominence.
Goes back to a couple of, I mean, we've looked at kind of the PPP journeys in the past, which was probably at the very high level aspect. I think it comes back to, in my mind, which verticals allow for this to happen. Because I think the question really comes down to risk. And if an owner is an infrequent builder, you know, I'm doing one project a decade.
Yeah.
Right. I know I'm gonna not make those decisions that fast. I don't even know what decision variables exist. It's kind of hard. But if I am an owner that's doing repeat businesses, right? If I'm doing medical centers, if I'm doing data centers, if I'm doing those repeat aspects, then I think you have some version of that where I know the risk I'm willing to take. I've done enough reps, and even those knowledge aspects are hard to kind of translate over multiple projects. But that's where you might see some of those changes. And what you see in some of those verticals is you'll just see the owner try to start pulling project management functions in-house because they start managing that risk. And it's like, well, I think I need to get involved more. Either because I can't contract out the risk or I'm taking the risk anyways, I'll just bring it in-house. So you'll see some version of it. But I have seen projects where you have a pool of money and everyone is incentivized, right? Down to the person who is driving the workers to and from to a job site, right? That level of incentivization gives you a very clear understanding of like, all right, we have one goal. We are looking to get this done
one
fast.
company. Yeah.
It's rare. I have not seen that happen a lot, right? It's not a repeat structure. Worked on in the past, trying to figure out how that might work at the grassroots level. And we've even seen startups do that, right? Which is like, hey, I'm going to figure out how to incentivize on a weekly basis. It's hard to, it's not easy to scale that.
Well, here's the thing. I think that in theory sounds great, right? I'm a big fan of IPD, but I think it comes back to culture. And you kind of mentioned this, right? Like the combative nature of the construction supply chain. And I think even if you force people into this type of collaborative contract, so much of whether or not a project operates that way is top-down leadership culture. And if the culture of the principals and the project executives, like if they're still doing things the kind of normal way, that collaboration and the incentives, like it doesn't kind of trickle down. And I've worked on 2 IPD-ish projects. One was very collaborative, very easy. The other one was not. And it's like, well, in theory, similar contracts, right? Not saying it's the same, the same companies or anything, but like so much of that culture is felt on site. And I do think that's why some of these challenges may just be generational changes. And we kind of just have to wait for some of those people to retire or move on with their lives before we see some of these cultural changes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, even thinking about technology adoption, it's a culture change problem.
Yeah.
Like, it's a real struggle.
There are some stories that I've heard where it's like, this company will not change XYZ tech until so-and-so dies.
It's like, wow. I think strong.
No, taking certain technology to the grave. And I mean, that's one thing that we do have to deal with.
That's a strong one. Not retire. Well, like, man, okay. Strong preferences. But no, I mean, if you think about like where have you seen the fastest adoption of technology, right? And it's often going to be contractors who've done some of these, you know, they have a technology culture DNA, or they're really ingesting that. It may be for marketing, doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, it's starting to build that culture DNA, and eventually it will flow down into projects. Great. If it's grassroots, even better. But I don't think it's never a short journey. And I think our industry is structured to rebuild a culture every project almost. Right. So you're almost the same, you know, argument that Alice was mentioning. Like, I can have all the right conditions in place, but if the people are different and they're not coming into the same culture or DNA, contracts are pieces of paper, right? That you're going to pull up when you don't have a real understanding. Forget about the the gentleman who said it, but it's real. So I think most what we've seen in our industry is there is a strong desire for adoption. I don't think anybody is aggressively pushing back. But I do think that workflows and the way our industry is structured is not meant for change that's very rapid. That's what you see in our industry, right? A lot of the industry adoption you will see is not going to be a straight vertical, adoption that you might see in other industries. But it is consistent growth year over year and extremely sticky. Once you get there, it's sticky. Now, AI may be a different aspect of things.
Yeah.
Sustainable growth there is a little bit of a question, to be honest. But I do think when a customer or our industry likes it, they will stick to it and build that into the DNA over time.
So that's a good place to end. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we've been riffing for a while. I can have more Vegemite.